Hi, class. We're going to start Unit 4 today with several readings that are all related. Uh, in general, Unit 4 is talking about professional ethics. It's not about professional ethics generally, but some specific medical ethics that come about based on the physician's role as a professional. So we'll do paternalism and truth-telling this week, and we'll, as well as informed consent, and then next week we'll turn to um, the final unit of the course, physician-assisted suicide. So that's what we're up to. And so we're going to start with paternalism and make some important clarifications. So right now, this is the Vaughan introduction. Uh, but it's important to notice that generally the dispute, the reason it's morally contentious is that paternalism is a very clear clash between beneficence and autonomy. So, whose autonomy? The patient's autonomy, their wishes, their choice. And the question is whether there are instances, circumstances, uh, places, rules where the physician should override a patient's autonomy in the name of beneficence. That is, doing what's good for the patient. So, we obviously make poor decisions in life, not all the decisions. Uh, but some decisions. Nobody's perfect. And here's something funny to really emphasize is that physicians are professionals, which means they are pretty much definitionally in a better position to make to make medical decisions for us than we are, or so it would seem. And so it's good to kind of pause before you get into the readings and think about, well, what's your knee jerk reaction? What's your gut reaction? If and one of the things you'll find is your gut reaction is often different if you're thinking of someone else versus you. So if you hear about patient X and patient X needs this life-saving treatment, but they don't want it because it carries a small risk, and you'd say, well, that's silly. Or you might feel like, well, you definitely feel like it seems silly to you. But you might be inclined to say, well, yeah, the doctor should ignore him in those because the doctor is just running the numbers and there's a better chance of life there. But now, imagine patient X is you. Because that's the funny thing, where we tend to be more comfortable when the doctor is overriding somebody else's autonomy for their own good, but we stop feeling so glib about it when we realize, well, what we say about patient X, we're really saying about ourselves. And so just kind of think about it for a minute. Well, if it meant I'm more likely to live or enjoy quality of life, etc., would I be comfortable with the doctor overriding my wishes? Or even the doctor lying to me? And it's good to just kind of explore your gut reactions there, because going back to Unit 1, people who are utility minded tend to gravitate more towards beneficence. People who are autonomy or sorry, tend to if you're utility minded, you tend to gravitate towards paternalism being okay. If you're autonomy minded, you tend to gravitate away from it. So it's good to just do a test and look at your own. So the uh, other than that, the Vaughan reading makes an important distinction between weak autonomy and strong, and this is a distinction of whether the patient is fully capable of making their own decisions. So it's considered weak autonomy when, oh my gosh, I keep saying autonomy. It's considered weak paternalism. So this is a distinction between strong and weak paternalism. It is considered weak paternalism if it's directed towards somebody who, for whatever reason, is not fully autonomous. Now, notice we do need an account of what it means to be fully autonomous there, but clearly children are not fully autonomous. We don't let them make their own medical decisions. Clearly, somebody who's in a coma is not fully autonomous. We don't let them make their own medical decisions. But there's some other interesting cases. There are some controversial cases a number of years ago about, well, what about somebody who's in extreme pain? There was a case where uh, somebody had been trapped in a burning car, and they had horrible burns over their whole body, and they were just in complete agony. And he basically was in such pain that he just kept saying, don't treat, don't treat, don't treat. Basically let me die. And the doctors treated them anyway because they took it as a case of weak paternalism, that the patient uh, was not fully autonomous because they were not thinking clearly, and they saved the patient's life, and then the patient sued them. So it's interesting about cases of severe pain. Is one where it might be a case of weak paternalism. So, uh, versus strong paternalism is when it goes against the wishes of someone who's substantially autonomous, such as the same coma patient if they had given a directive in advance about how to be treated, or an adult who seems rational, various standards, things like that. So notice there's a little bit of gray area in terms of whether a patient is fully autonomous or not, which means whether it's weak paternalism or strong. But here's why the distinction is relevant. It is pretty much granted on all hands that cases of clear weak paternalism are morally permissible, that the doctor is not doing anything objectionable or wrong in, say, ignoring a child's wishes, or treating somebody the best they're capable who is in a coma, et cetera, et cetera. And so we usually think of weak paternalism as okay, and then strong paternalism is the morally contentious bit. Now, some people who argue in favor of strong paternalism will just build it off of the weak paternalism and say, well, we're roughly in the same situation for these reasons. So it's a good distinction to know, but it's also good to realize what the actual controversy is. And the controversy, generally speaking, is not with weak paternalism. Lastly, I just wanted to point out there is a mistake in Vaughan. When Vaughan is defining advanced directives, Vaughan actually just gives the definition of a living will. Advanced directive is a little more broad than that. Uh, so organ donation stuff is an advanced directive. DNRs, there's things besides living wills that count as advanced directives. So advanced directive is a family that includes living wills. So just any uh, legal instruction that is given to the hospital about treatment, etc., counts as an advanced directive, including living wills. Lastly, the other thing I wanted to draw your attention to in the Vaughan before we get started in the media articles is the discussion of medical futility. Is going to come up and be important both in this and in physician-assisted suicide next week. Just thinking in terms of when medicine can't do anything becomes important in a lot of these types of decisions. So just pay attention to that discussion. Otherwise, if you're ready, I'm ready to discuss the two paternalism articles, the Dworkin and the Goldman articles. Both of them are nuanced views. Uh, the Dworkin article is definitely a little tricky, and so I really want to draw your attention to kind of what you're expected and what might need to be a little bit, I might be a little more forgiving on. But I want to draw your attention to one important scope difference first. The Dworkin article is talking about paternalism generally. That is, he's trying to draw a line for when it's okay to use paternalism ever. That includes legally, uh, generally in terms of laws. By contrast, the Goldman article is specifically about medical paternalism. And so uh, they're both still very relevant, of course, but just be advised that's going on. So let's start with the Dworkin. Again, it's a longer, thicker article, but I'm going to draw your attention to some of the important themes. And he starts with a discussion of Mill and John Stuart Mill on liberty. Uh, it is only okay to so this is the original claimant on liberty, but he's going to unpack it carefully. So it is only okay to go against somebody's will to prevent a greater harm. So think of just about every law ever, as we talked about last week. Well, um, suppose somebody really wants to murder somebody. Well, you're okay in impinging upon that will because it prevents harm to others. And so usually the claim is that's the only time it's okay to interfere is if you're going to harm somebody else. That's kind of the backbone of libertarianism. That's pretty closely. But Mill is going to add something a little more nuanced when it comes to paternalism. Because notice the case of stopping a murderer isn't paternalistic. It's not, we're not doing it for the murderer's own good. We're doing it for somebody else's own good. And so this is something we need to be careful in distinguishing. And Dworkin, the article who's talking about Mill, is going to draw this out in terms of what he calls pure and impure paternalism. So pure paternalism is solely for the benefit of the person whose will you're overthrowing. So he gives an example of what would a purely paternalistic act look like: an anti-suicide law. And yes, there are anti-suicide laws in many states because it's made to protect the person who would be harming themselves. So he says seatbelt laws. I'm going to get back to that in a minute because it's theoretically just protecting the person whose seatbelt is being worn. Things like that. So a purely paternalistic act, you're overcoming the autonomy of the person you're trying to benefit. Uh, Notice that's what's going to come up in medicine quite a bit, right? That we're overcoming the patient's will in order to benefit the patient. So that's what he calls pure paternalism. Impure paternalism, we're trying to benefit others. And it's not even clear that counts as paternalism, but that would be an example of the anti-murder case. And so what we're really interested in overall is pure utilitarianism. But another clarification by Dworkin in section 4, if the person's judgment is not being overridden, it's not paternalism. So what we're talking about is when somebody's judgment is being overridden and it's being overridden for their benefit. Okay, so that's, if you're following along, that's about to the end of section 4, where kind of the clarification starts and he stops and he really starts digging into the meat. But I want to mention there's something important to consider about the seatbelt law example he gives. It's usually considered incorrect nowadays to say that seatbelt laws are purely paternalistic. Why? Because society incurs a heavy, heavy cost when somebody dies unexpectedly. So let me knock on wood and give an example. Suppose at about week 5 of the semester, I, Mickey Lurkowski, this guy died in a car accident. People besides me are going to be harmed significantly by that. So, specifically, all of you and all of my other students and my colleagues. It creates this huge hole because there is a massive social cost in someone dying unexpectedly. So, and it's a way that it isn't incurred if if a 99-year-old dies peacefully in their sleep. It's seatbelt laws are a little tricky because ultimately they are protecting society, and so it's not clear that that's a case of pure paternalism, but it's just something to bear in mind. It's the things get a little thicker, and this is also why in section 2 he says it's really hard to find a purely paternalistic action because the old John Donne funeral oration, "No man is an island entirely of himself." When somebody dies, it hurts everybody, and so anyway, that's a complication that we need to clarify and just be careful of. But we can fix that by talking about bulk of the intended benefit, blah, 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 blah. So let's get back to section 5. So we're interested in these purely paternalistic actions. Of course, it's okay to go against somebody's will if it's to prevent harm to others. But here's the funny thing that surprises people sometimes, and this is something that we're going to see echoed in the Goldman. So remember, Mill, John Stuart Mill, is a utilitarian to the core, but he thinks, and Dworkin is discussing this, so that's why we're talking about it. Mill thinks that um, paternalism actually has negative utility, or put another way, that being anti-paternalist is being utilitarian. So why think that uh, that being paternalistic carries with it a negative utility cost, or at least compared to not being paternalistic? So the comparison is between giving somebody the choices and hoping they choose right, versus not giving them the choice and just making them do the decision you think is right. And again, when we're talking about strong paternalism, strong pure paternalism, I guess we'll have to say. And what Mill says, and what Dworkin thinks something is deeply correct here, is that we know our own interests better than the person making the decision for us. So nobody knows me better than me. Nobody knows what makes me happy better than me. And if you give me the decision, I'm more likely to go towards the decision that makes me happy, that increases my utility, than somebody who's making it for me. And so there is what Mill calls a presumption against paternalism. That is in general, it's a bad thing. But Dworkin very importantly points out it is a presumption, not a prohibition. There are going to be cases of paternalism that are going to be okay and be but they're going to be a narrow class. And so what do we have to do? The legwork. We go back to the beginning of the semester. We're not going to say paternalism's always okay. We're not going to say paternalism's never okay. We have to find out the sometimes okay. And Dworkin's going to do that kind of through the seatbelt law and through thinking about Mill's worry there about we generally know our own interests better. And so in section 6, he's really going to develop his own account. That's the most important section. And he's going to talk about children, of course, because, again, nobody thinks that we are doing something wrong in protecting a child from themselves. That being paternalistic towards children. That's where the name paternalism comes from, right? You're treating someone like a child. Well, you should treat children like children. So clearly sometimes it's okay. So when is it okay? This is what I told you, that they're going to use the weak to tease out the strong. We usually think of it as okay as being paternalistic when we have what's called future-oriented consent. That we think that if the child were to fully come of age and find out where we overrode them back at this time, they would say, yeah, I'm glad you did that. So I have a 5-year-old daughter who actually she's getting much better about this, but when she was 4, maybe certainly 3, uh, if she had her own way, she would eat cotton candy as her meal every day. And of course, I, as a parent, say, well, no, you're not going to eat cotton candy every day. We're going to limit it in these certain ways, protect the pancreas, da 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 da. Always try to explain why these rules exist to her, and it sinks in eventually. But anyway, do I feel bad about that? No, because I know that, if we fast forward to when she's 20, and I'd say, well, are you glad that we, forced some standard of health upon you to make sure that you grew up okay and stuff, instead of just letting you eat cotton candy every meal? She would say yes. Anyone who's fully rational, I think, would say yes. I'm glad you did not let me eat cotton candy every meal there. So that's, for Dworkin, that's the answer to why is it okay to be paternalistic towards children when we have this future-oriented consent. And so what he thinks is that we can actually apply that to cases of other paternalism, just broaden the answer, uh, because we are aware of our own deficiencies. He gives an example that he knows that sometimes he's acting irrationally about seatbelts. Either he forgets or he thinks some people might misweigh the value and disvalue of a seatbelt, like we tended to do with masks during the pandemic. And the general idea is, well, I know I'm not perfect, but there are cases where I'd be comfortable with somebody protecting me because I'm not perfect. Much like the future-oriented consent, Dworkin is going to say, and this is kind of his big thesis, Dworkin is going to say paternalism is okay when it is what a fully rational person would accept as protection. So we say, instead of talking about future, just imagine a fully rational person. And there's no fully rational people, by the way. We all have our irrationalities and our nuance and our blind spots. But if this is a protection that a fully rational person would accept as part of their protection, then that is a paternalism that is okay. And that's the general answer he's going to draw across the board regarding paternalism. All right, I realize this is going to be a long video, but we've covered the Vaughan intro, and we've basically covered the Dworkin. Again, his main thesis he's developing is strong paternalism is okay when it's what a fully rational person would accept as protection. That still leaves some gray areas that he talks about later. We are going to go on to the Goldman. So the Goldman is a little easier, but if you need to, take a pause and process whatever, this is a good breaking point. Otherwise, let's talk about the Goldman. The title is the refutation of medical paternalism. So notice he seems to be against paternalism within medicine. And what is he going to do there? Well, he's going to do some careful setup first. He's going to separate arguments that patient is not harmed by paternalism versus the harm is unclear in paternalism versus the patient is harmed, but somehow the will's built in, so it's okay. Then he's going to say, well, assuming their paternalism were categorically okay, for instance, in the way that Dworkin suggests, he thinks this would radically change the practice and perception of medicine. And so what that means is we would have to change medicine into something that doesn't fit into our basic moral framework. It would have to be done very, very differently. And even doing that might include some negative utility. For instance, if people are not trusting of doctors when they go in. But after all of that, he's going to introduce his important thesis here. When we're given the usual the usual argument for paternalism, there's a faulty premise, which means the argument is unsound, and we don't have to accept the conclusion. And this is the assumption made by doctors that health is our highest priority. And what I should say is that health is always our highest priority. And that's really the beginning of the end in terms of paternalism for Goldman. He's going to say, well, wait a minute. First of all, we know that health is not people's highest priority. Okay? How do we know that? Because we do unhealthy stuff all the time. Think about the food you have put into your body in the last week. Or the sleep deprivation you have given yourself, et cetera, et cetera. We do all sorts of things that are detrimental to our health. What does that tell us? Things besides health is going on. Well, did anybody stay up late and get sleep deprived doing a paper or studying? Probably. What happens? What's going on when you do that? Well, I'm doing something I know is bad for my health because I have another priority, succeeding in college. And so it's very, very clear if you just look around the world, look around at your life, that health is not always our highest priority. It's not to say it's never our highest priority, but it's not always our highest priority. But to give the doctor medical decisions over us is basically to assume if the doctor's deciding for me, they're deciding based on health reasons. First of all, that's what they do. But second of all, it's the only thing they're qualified to do. A doctor is not qualified to make life choices for me. The doctor is only qualified to make health choices for me. And so the argument in favor of paternalism simply assumes something false, that health is always our highest priority. But ultimately, doctors don't know everything that's going on in our lives. They don't know our other interests. And as such, they're likely to err in their decisions. If they're trying to decide what's best for me, that's not the same as saying what's healthiest for me. And so this is where the this is where paternalism breaks down. Well, because if who's going to know what's best for me? Me, the one who knows all the other stuff that's going on in my life right now. And so, uh, as such, this fundamentally undermines the argument, the main argument in favor of paternalism, medical paternalism, according to Goldman. So, and lastly, at the end, he's going to kind of shore this up and saying, well, we know that self-determination is valuable. We imagine, kind of the really, really overbearing parents that, like, since the person's 3 says that you have to. Sorry, my dog was snoring. Uh, the overbearing parents who say that, well, you have to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever since the kid's 3, and say the kid really doesn't want to do it. Well, most of us would say there's something wrong there, that forcing somebody into a career path they don't want is wrong. Why? Because we think there's this value in self-determination, and as such, anything that is going to try to override self-determination has a strong burden of proof. And we've already seen some other arguments from utilitarians in that regard. So there's this huge burden of proof that says, well, wait a minute, if we're overriding on autonomy, we would need this strong burden, and the medical and just for the sake of one's health just does not achieve that burden. So that's what I wanted to say about the Goldman. Again, feel free to pause there if you want. The last bit, the Vaughn's introduction to truth telling, is so it's just an introduction, but as we're going to see, it's really an application of paternalism. But historically it was seen differently. That it was okay for doctors to lie to patients, and it's really only historically, like around 1980, so 43 years ago, that we started saying that deception is a type of harm. But why are we talking about this now? Because the only reason for a doctor to lie or withhold information from a patient is paternalistic reasons. Having said that, Vaughn does kind of this social examination, and they'll find that, well, certain countries say, yeah, they don't throw up the fuss about lying or withholding information from patients based on their culture. So it's interesting in those regards to think about, well, how much of my knee-jerk reaction about this is really just, coming from the society in which I was raised. The U.S. is and always has put like an incredibly high emphasis on autonomy, and so it's not surprising that in the U.S. we favor truth telling and are anti-paternalistic. But there are other ways of living. And then the last thing I wanted to add in the truth telling is Vaughn discusses confidentiality and right to privacy. Those are different in the sense that confidentiality is ethical. It is wrong to breach confidence. whereas right to privacy is simply legal. Uh, it is that you're committing a crime by violating right to privacy. So uh, both of them involve some sort of promise, either contractually or verbally, not to share information. But there's some really interesting case studies at the end. So think about the HIV example and things like that in terms of the gray areas with confidentiality. But anyway, that we've already gone pretty long, and I think that reading's pretty straightforward. So maybe I'll just pause it there, and you could follow up with any questions. Otherwise, we will see you next time when we start talking about. Um, I should probably know this when we start talking about informed consent. All right.